And I appreciate all of you coming out tonight to hear my talk. It's not often I get a chance to talk about my favorite subject. The Brea Tar Pits is something I was been reading about and studying for over 20 years. I first ran across it in a book called The Genesis Flood, and I think I was talking with Carolyn about that there, and how the Genesis Flood, published in 1961 by Henry Morris and John Wickham, kind of turned around the whole thinking of Christians regarding how the Bible is the go-to book for anything regarding science. And so there's a brief mention of the Brea Tar Pits in that book, and I thought, well, that's right near where I live, Los Angeles. So I thought maybe I should just go there and check it out. So as I came to study more and more about it, I came to the conclusion that the Genesis Flood book was correct, that this is proof of the Genesis Flood. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name is Bill Weston. I became a Christian December 18th, 1972, led by the Lord by a godly man. I met my wife Robin in Biola College, and we got married and had 6 kids, and I'm very glad for all of them walking with the Lord, and I'm very proud to have Kevin being a pastor of this church. And I really enjoyed meeting you all and talking with you, and it's thank you for making us feel very welcome here. I really appreciate that. Okay, so yeah, it started off with a question. We had some visitors from out of town, and I said, well, it's not inexpensive. It's not inexpensive to go to the Brea Tar Pits. We took our visitors there, and Kevin was the one who asked the question, about them. So I decided to read articles and look into journals, and I actually went to the museum, and I talked to the man who was in charge of the fossil collection, and I said to him, I think that these animals died in a global flood, and asked him, well, what do you think about that? And of course he disagreed with me. He was, the people at the Brea Tar Pits are definitely of the evolution mindset. But this, his name is Chris Shaw. He accepted my eccentric ideas, I guess, from his point of view, and he allowed me to go in the back area of the museum and study the fossils firsthand and read the field notes. So you don't really get a good picture of La Brea Tar Pits just by going online and Googling La Brea Tar Pits, because it doesn't give you a whole lot of information. The information that I think that is important is actually examining the bones, reading the field notes, going to the university and finding these obscure articles and reading them, and that's where you really find good, solid information. Okay, so this is the saber-toothed cat. He's one of the most famous animals of the La Brea Tar Pits. He's famous because he's got those really long canines, and he looks like a really ferocious animal, doesn't he? Really could use those canines to do a lot of damage. But we're going to talk about the saber-toothed cat towards the end of this talk, and I think you'll find some things that are surprising about this cat. Let's see. La Brea Tar Pits is located in the city of Los Angeles, and there it is, a little bit of green in the midst of concrete and asphalt. And, and this strange looking building, that's the art museum. And over here is the museum where they keep the animals of the Brea Tar Pits. And a lot of the tar pits are right around in this very small area. There's like about 14 tar pits that had bones in them. And we're going to be talking about a lot of those tar pits. The animals of the Brea Tar Pits as they lived before the Genesis flood. When I looked at these bones, I was thinking, well, this must have been an animal that lived during Noah's time. And what was it like for that animal to be alive during that time? And as I read more about Henry Morris and other books, it appears at that time was a time when there was a great variety of animals, a great variety of plants. It was a lush tropical environment. Animals grew to huge sizes. Of course, we have the dinosaurs. They were enormous, but the mammals of that time were huge. Like we're all familiar with the buffalo, but the buffalo, the Brea Tar Pits, were somewhat larger than the buffalo that we see today. We have in the fossil record giant rodents, giant beavers, kangaroos that are big. Even the insects were large, and they found insects in the fossil record, like the dragonflies. They had found them with 2-foot wingspans. I saw dragonflies over at Wilson Lake, and of course they were only like 4 or 5 inch wingspans at largest, but can you imagine a 2-foot wingspan dragonfly? Or cockroaches about 5 inches big from the head to the tail. So they grew to large sizes, and when I looked at these bones, I was impressed by what I was looking at as animals who lived during Noah's time. So over here we have, vultures, and here we have the saber-toothed cat. This is a giant ground sloth, 2 of them, and in the back we have elephants. So this is typical of the animals that we find at the Brea Tar Pits. They didn't find any dinosaurs. They were all mammals. I do believe that dinosaurs lived at the same time as these mammals, as well as with man. And I go with the Usher chronology that the world was created 6,000 years ago, and the flood was 4,400 years ago. Okay, so if you go to the Brea Tar Pits, this is kind of like what the first thing you'll see. This kind of display. This is a mammoth elephant, and it looks like it's sinking into a tar pool. And here's a baby elephant and another mammoth elephant, and they're kind of concerned watching this other elephant go down into the depths. And it looks like the pool will just totally submerge this elephant. And that's the idea that the Brea Tar Pits want to show everybody, that this is an animal entrapment site. That these animals, thinking that this tar pool is more like a water hole, and they walk in to get a drink, and then the tar sticks, they get stuck in the tar, and they go down and sink, and just like quicksand, they go down. So that's their idea of their explanation of why there's so many of these bones in the Brea Tar Pits. And so I'm going to give you some facts regarding the tar pits, and I'll let you be the judge to discern whether their idea is true or whether my idea that these animals died in a global flood is true. Let's kind of consider the size of the tar pits. I have here an Indian character, and here's a mammoth elephant. They're kind of to scale. The mammoth elephants were a lot bigger than the modern elephants that you see today. And this is kind of an example of a tar pit. It's kind of funnel shaped, and the bones would be from the top all the way down to maybe, this is like 30 feet in maybe 15 feet in diameter, and the bones go down about 30 feet, and then there's a channel or something, a hole that continues down to these oil deposits, and this oil continuously comes up to the surface, and the volatile parts of the oil kind of evaporates as it's coming up, so that when it actually comes to the surface of the ground, it's tar. This tar is very sticky, very gooey. If it gets on your shoes and clothes, you might as well throw them away. You'll never get it off, but it's tar. But this is kind of like the size of the tar pits in general. 14 of these holes. Some of them were even smaller in diameter, like one pit that had camels and a baby mammoth in it, wolves, ground sloths. It was only 4 foot in diameter. So that's pretty small for a pit, tar pit. But do you think that? But this is one of the larger ones. Do you think that mammoth elephant could get in that tar pit? Let's see. I don't think this elephant, no matter how hard he tried, will get down so he's totally submerged. But this elephant, he's a big show-off, and he's determined, and he wants to get down in there, probably thinking the Indian friend will get him out. So he wants to get down totally into the tar pit, so his head is totally below the level. So the Indian helps him out. So he builds a platform, and just like Dumbo the elephant, he dives down from the platform, and with enough velocity in his dive, he will achieve total submergence into the tar pit. So that's just a humorous illustration of how small these tar pits are. This is the George C. Page Museum, where we see a lot of these where they collect the bones. They have a laboratory that they clean the tar off the bones, and then they study them, write articles about them. People all over the world come to this museum to study the bones, because these bones are world famous. They're world famous because not only because there was a huge number of bones found in these pits, but also because the quality of preservation is just really good. The bones, you could even see the channels of the blood vessels that go through the bones. They're so well preserved. So the La Brea Tar Pits have attracted a lot of scientists from around the world. But an interesting thing about George C. Page, he was, and do you remember those mission packs back in the 40s and 50s people used to send around Christmas time? He started that, and it was like fruits and nuts and chocolates, and they were in a pack, and people would use that as Christmas gifts. He was also a realtor, but he was also a man who believed in the Bible. So as I was talking to people at the museum about George C. Page, they kind of joke about him. But I think that maybe he saw something in these animals that were being discovered that needed to be preserved. Otherwise, they would be stuck in a warehouse where nobody could see them. And maybe reading the Genesis flood. I don't know. Here's a skeletal reconstruction of an imperial mammoth elephant, the largest animal found in the Brea Tar Pits. And there were many animals found in the tar pits. Here's a skeleton of a saber-toothed cat. This is the bison or buffalo. And then we have the giant ground sloth. So that's what you see in the museum. Here I am with a saber-toothed cat skull. This one I'm holding is a replica of a saber-toothed cat skull. It's about the same size and the same weight, and it has the saber teeth. And this is the top part of the skull. And then I'm showing you there the lower jaw of the animal. Now, when I examined the skulls at the museum, I noticed that they were real bone. It was not petrified. I also saw at the museum the skulls that there was no hair on them, no skin. It was totally bare. It also had the look of being freshly deboned. You know, we were deboning chicken bones this afternoon, you know, and taking the meat off and storing the meat and throwing away the bones. But it had that fresh look, like somebody just pulled the skin off and left the bone. And it didn't look like it was out in the sun. You know how bones get, if they've been out in the sun, they get this white, flaky, cracked look. None of the bones I examined had that look, that they've been out in the sun, been weathered by wind and rain and so forth. They look like they had the skin taken off and immediately put in preservation, or put in the tar. Let's see. I turned the skull over, and the ones there's certain skulls that I examined, that I read about in articles, and I picked a certain one out that had been totally cleaned out the inside of it. This is the foramen magnum. This is where the spinal cord of the animal goes into the skull and attaches to its brain. And here's another picture of there's the foramen magnum. So most of the skulls that I examined at in the laboratory there, the whole inside of its head, from the outer part of this hole all the way into the brain case, was just filled with tar and all kinds of debris in it. So all trace of brain was gone. The spinal cord was totally gone. How did that happen? I mean, it's kind of weird. And some scientists back in the 1940s said, well, I want to see what kind of insects were inside this tar that was inside the head of the skull. So he cleaned it out. And so I noticed that there was, as I looked inside the hole, I saw there was nothing in it, and there was a few particles inside that if you shook it, you could hear it rattling inside. But there was no trace of a brain inside. And the skull was totally bare of soft tissue inside and out. Okay. So, so absolutely none of the bones had soft tissues. Thousands and thousands of bones have been recovered from these tar pits, cataloged and stored. There was not one hair on them. There was no skin, no cartilage, no internal organs, absolutely nothing, just bare bones. But tar is a preservative. As in the case of Egyptian mummies, the word mummy means bitumen or tar. So the ancient Egyptians would use the tar or slime that we read in the Bible, the book of Genesis, as a preservative to preserve their dead. So as we see that they had this kind of a chocolate or milk chocolate kind of look to them, these mummies, that's because of the tar that they put on them. And as you can see, they have their hair, their skin, and they had their internal organs. So my question here for you to think about as I go on is, why do the animals of the Brea Tar Pits lack hair, skin, and internal organs? Because tar, as I said, is a preservative. Okay. Let's see. So what was the most common animal at the Brea Tar Pits? As we see here, we have a camel and a bison, a ground sloth, a horse, saber-toothed cat, and wolf. Okay, so if this was an animal entrapment site, which animal do you think would be the most common in there? You know, think about it. I've asked people this question, they would say, well, buffalo is kind of common. There's lots of them. So I would say that the most common animal in the Brea Tar Pits is the buffalo. Another person would say, well, ground sloths are kind of slow and they probably, if they got stuck in a tar pit, they wouldn't be able to get out. So I think the ground sloths would be the most common animal in the tar pit. Probably not the wolves, because there aren't that many wolves. You know, we see a lot more deer out in the out in nature, but we hardly see very many wolves. How many of you have ever seen a wolf out in the wild? You seen a wolf out in the wild? Okay, we have one hand. So, pretty rare sight, I guess. Well, the most common animal of the Brea Tar Pits is the wolf. And these columns represent numbers, and this represents 1,600 individual wolves that were found in the Brea Tar Pits. The next most common is the saber-toothed cats, and then the coyotes and the lions. These four represent the predators. And then over here, we have the bison. It was the most common plant-eating animal in the Brea Tar Pits. Then the horse, giant ground sloth, camel, then a smaller ground sloth, and then the antelope. So this is very strange. The predators, the carnivores, the meat-eating animals predominate in the La Brea Tar Pits. And in nature, they made statistical calculations, and there's about, the average is 100 to 200 herbivores, plant-eating animals, to every meat-eating animal. So, for example, like in Minnesota, you'll see one wolf for every 100 to 200 deer out there. In the African savanna, you'll see 100 zebra to one lion. You know, we're just taking averages. So we're seeing something very strange here at the Brea Tar Pits that is not what we see in nature. Let me give you a ratio here. Carnivore to herbivore ratio. Okay, so I have here, there's 1 coyote, 5 wolves, and 3 saber-toothed cats, and 1 antelope. This reflects the numbers that we see in the Brea Tar Pits. So imagine this scenario. This is what you'll hear at the Brea Tar Pits. They'll say, this little antelope gets caught in the tar, in the pool, it's sinking, and a whole swarm of carnivores will jump on top of the antelope to get something to eat, and they all go down at the same time. I never found that very plausible to me. all these predators jumping on 1 antelope to get the numbers that we see in the Brea Tar Pits. But here's another strange thing about the tar pits that is not very often talked about. Why does only 1 bone out of tens of thousands have teeth marks? And it's not a plant-eating bone, it's a lion's bone. So we find all these plant-eating animal bones in the tar pits. You would think that if they were trying to get a meal off the antelope or the horse or the camel or the ground sloth, there would be teeth marks on the bones. And absolutely none of them have any teeth marks whatsoever. And they've studied all these bones. And I was able to confirm this with Mr. Shaw, that this is the only bone in the whole La Brea Tar Pits that had teeth marks on it. So that's kind of strange, too. I've seen bones out when I was up in Northern California, Calaveras County, with my wife. I was checking out some fossils up there, and we went out to the pasture, and we saw some cow bones, bare, white, flaky. They've obviously been out in the sun, and they had that decayed look. And I could see that some predator had chewed on them, or there was evidence of carnivore activity on them. I didn't see any of that on any of these bones. None of them had that evidence of carnivore activity. Okay, so we talked about the mammals. Now let's talk about birds. What was the most common bird at the Brea Tar Pits? So we have pigeon, duck, vulture. These animals were found in the Brea Tar Pits, all of these. Pigeon, duck, vulture, hawk, turkey, owl, stork, eagle. Which one do you think would, for an animal entrapment site, which one do you think would be the most common? Well, the what?
Seems like a vulture would be, if it was.
A vulture, that's a good idea. A vulture would probably, but what about pigeons or ducks? I think we see a lot of those. Okay, so the most common animal in the bird in the tar pits is the eagle. There's 2 kinds of eagles, the golden eagle and the bald eagle, and both eagles were found in La Brea Tar Pits, and there were almost 1,400 eagles found in the tar pits. Over here we have, this is turkeys. There was like almost 700 turkeys. These are the songbirds, like sparrows, finches. Here we have pigeons and doves. This is ducks and geese, shorebirds, storks and herons, and here's the eagles. This is falcons and hawks, condors and vultures, and owls. So I see vultures, but I never seen a condor before. But we get huge numbers of condors in La Brea Tar Pits. So as we've seen with the mammals, there seems to be a pattern here. The predatory animals is also with the birds too. The predatory birds predominate in the La Brea Tar Pits. They're like 70% of the total. The other 30% is the non-predatory birds right here. These 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These 6 types of birds. They represent total 30%. To give you an idea of a modern tar pit, birds trapped in a modern tar pit. What do we find in that? Do we find the predators dominating in a modern tar pit? In the early 1300s, a road construction crew left a tar pit by the side of Hermit Rim Road near Grand Canyon Village. Birds were getting caught in the tar pit. 131 birds, 13 different species, including sparrows, woodpeckers, sapsuckers, crossbills. 6 of these birds were hawks, 5% of the total. This reflects the expected balance of predatory birds in nature. Conclusion, there is no reason why hawks, owls, eagles, condors, and vultures should be 70% of the total trapped birds in La Brea Tar Pits. So here we have a modern tar pit, and the birds that were trapped in there represent the statistical number of birds that we see in nature, the non-predatory birds predominating over the predatory birds. So it's kind of strange. What about beetles or insects? We have lots of water beetles, in thousands and thousands of water beetles. Very few ants, dragonflies, butterflies. Water beetles, it's interesting that the water beetles are predator insects. They will go after other insects. They'll even go after small fish. So they're very aggressive little creatures. And so we've seen a pattern here that the predatory creatures, mammals, birds, and insects are the ones we find in La Brea Tar Pits. But it's funny why would water beetles swim around in tar? I don't get that. Okay. So here's the La Brea Tar Pits as seen in 1910. Prior to this time, people didn't know there were any bones in tar pits. All they saw was this field of asphalt. This is really rock hard. You could only break it up with a hammer or with dynamite. But back in the 1800s, they would excavate this asphalt, boil it down, and make blocks for road pavement, particularly Los Angeles and San Francisco. And as they dug down, that's when they found the tar pits. And so it's about that time that they started excavating it for bones. And here's like 3 tar pits kind of together. These are men working the pit. This is one tar pit here, and then there's a second one and a third one over here. And that's kind of what you would see if you were watching men taking out the bones out of the tar pits. So the time of the excavation of tar pits was around 1910 to 1917, and all the pits were dug out except one. They left one to kind of be as a display, Pit 91, and they're really taking their time on Pit 91. Year after year during the summer, volunteers would go into Pit 91, and they would just look for anything they can find. They would find pollen, uh, uh, snail shells, uh, uh, bits of wood, all kinds of things, and they track and they plot everything that they find. So this is a project that's supposed to go on for many, many years, maybe another 100 years. So, but it's mostly for to show people what it's like to for an excavation of a tar pit to go on. And but what they find is that broken, scattered bones. The bones that they find in the tar pits look like they've been through some. It looked like some violent force had torn these animals limb by limb and just scattered them, and also the bones themselves had suffered a lot of damage. Most of the saber-toothed cat skulls lack their teeth because they were broken off after the death of the animal. They know when teeth get broken off during its lifetime versus after its death, and most of the damage that we see on the bones is after its death. And they're all mixed up. So you see a wolf skull next to a camel leg bone, next to a horse pelvis, next to an elephant toe bone. So it's just all mixed up in every possible way, broken, scattered. They've also found tree. This is the biggest tree that they found in the Brea Tar Pits, and it was totally saturated with water. It looked like it had been floating sometime in water and had soaked up that water completely. And the tar had sealed in that water so that when they recovered that tree, they saw that it was just full of water. And that's true for all the wood, all the brush, all the leaves. They were all looked like that. Well, they were drenched with water, saturated totally. So you have, and just like with the bones, most of the wood is fragments of wood. It looks like some powerful wind or explosion had blown up these trees, and then you just have pieces left. And this is the most intact tree of all. It's missing the top part of the tree, and some of the roots were gone, but this is the most intact one. But most of the wood that they found was fragments. Okay, so I get it? Oh, like the animals and trees, none of the insects were intact. So like I read somewhere, I'm trying to find the source, but there was some cockroaches that got into some of the tar that was excavated back in 1910, 1912 or whatever. They went back and they were cleaning up. This is like 70 years later. The cockroaches were just exactly like what they were when they went in, when they got trapped by the tar. The tar soaked on them, and they were totally preserved. But the insects of the Brea Tar Pits, not one part of the insect was left together with another part. So the legs were all torn apart, the body, the head, everything was gone. I mean, everything was all torn apart. So this is an example of one insect. It's a carrion beetle, scientific name Necrophorus, and okay. So when I went to the Brea Tar Pits and I was looking for insects, there was not one complete insect. All you see is fragments of insects. So how did they know how many insects there were? Well, they just count heads. That's basically how they do it. Count the heads, and that's how they count the water beetle heads. that's how they get the numbers of the water beetles, is by counting the heads, the ants, and maybe the butterfly wings, the left wing, or so forth. So, and just as and you remember how when the saber-toothed cat had no brain in it? Well, that's the way with the insects. So here's the head of the carrion beetle right here, and here's the square area, and this is what it looks like in the Brea Tar Pits. Its mouth parts are gone, the eyes are gone, and when you look inside this is the foramen magnum of the insect, and you look inside there, it's totally empty. It's all the inner parts of the head of the insect is gone. And so they keep these things in little test tubes, and I put it out on the sheet. I was very careful with it. And I was able to examine it in a magnifying glass, and it's true, there's nothing in there. So we see something here that is, so what happened to all these animals, trees, and insects? My idea is that it was Noah's Ark during the Genesis flood. Here's 2 Peter 3:6, whereby the world that there then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So we see in the Bible that the world was overflowed with water, and all the creatures perished except for the ones in Noah's Ark. So what happened to the animals and the insects and the birds during that period of time as the water was rising? So let me take you back in time. What do you think the animals will be doing? Well, they'll be running for the hills, right? The ones, you don't stay in the valleys, you go up to the hills. That's where you'll get safety from the water, not knowing that the whole world is going to be overflowed with water. So what I see with that period of time during the flood is a sorting of animals. All these animals are running for safety in the hills. So they're running for the hills, and they're trying to escape the water. And so the ones who can make it to the top of the hill would survive the longest. The slower animals like rabbits or can't go very far, like rabbits and snakes and turtles, they're going to die first, and then they'll get buried. And then the other animals that can move faster, like wolves can cover a lot of ground. They made studies in Minnesota. They can cover like 60 miles in a day. So they can go long distances. And of course, there'll be the camels, the bison, and they can go long distances too. But as the land area gets smaller and smaller, there's going to be a lot of competition for the last remaining ground. And the animals with the teeth and the muscle power and the speed are going to prevail. They're going to win against the animals that don't have that, like the horses and the camels. So there's going to be a ferocious competition for the last remaining ground. So you're going to see, I'm postulating, a huge concentration of predatory kind of animals as the last survivors of the flood. But they all perish in the end. So here's the geologic timetable that you see in your textbooks. And Henry Morris and John Wickham in their book Genesis Flood say that the geologic column that we see is not evolution through time, but rather it's sorting of animals by size, speed, and muscle power. So this is the age of mammals. This is the dinosaur age, and this is the very early age. But I see the dinosaur age and the mammal age together, but scientists have separated them and made one older than the other. But according to my idea, the Paleocene animals would have more of the slow-moving, stout, sluggish animals, whereas the Pleistocene age would have the fast-moving, more carnivorous type animals. And so here's the early mammal age. You see here the rodents, and you see these squatty, short-legged kind of animals, and you see a lot of flightless birds. So they would say that the flightless birds were the early birds. Oops, back. Hit too many. Okay, so you have the. This is the largest bird. Brea Tar Pits is the Teratorn. There's no other bird in the world like it today. It's just gigantic. Then they have the lion, and the short-faced bear, and the deer. So you see how you have a lot of birds that can fly, and you have these animals that have longer legs and can move long distances. So at the end as the flood killed off all the animals, the gases that build up in their inside the bodies would cause them to float on the water. Water action dissolves flesh and removes limbs. And as the limbs drop off, they're going to go sink down, and there'll be a scatter pattern around the underwater. And then you'll only have bare bones left, no soft tissue. So the water will just remove everything inside and out. After the waters subside, there'll be bones scattered all across the landscape, everywhere. And they'll be all mixed up. All the animals will be, you won't find any complete skeletons. And so let's go back to the Brea Tar Pits. How did they form? Well, the best explanation is that there was a period of turmoil after the floodwaters subsided. There was earthquakes, there's mountain building activity. And so the petroleum deposits underneath the earth would expel its natural gas first, and then the tar or oil will come up. So that as the natural gas comes up, it'll create these funnel-shaped craters. And then as the waters kept moving back and forth across the landscape, some of the bones will fill up the holes, and then the tar will come up to this from deep below the earth. Will rise up to fill the pits and overflow the surface of the ground. So here's an example. Now there's tar pits around the world, and they reflect that same situation where there's no soft tissues. But here in Eastern Europe, they found a woolly rhinoceros. It was preserved in tar, and it had all its flesh, and the only thing missing was its fur and its hoofs. Everything else was complete. So how did that happen? Well, I noticed that in that area of the world, that's pretty close to the Arctic Circle, and the waters are very cold there. And in Lake, I read about Lake Superior, how the waters are very cold there, and if somebody falls off the boat or if an animal drowns in the water, they'll just sink right to the bottom. They don't come back up. So I postulate that the animals of the Brea Tar Pits were in warm water, in a warmer climate, so that's how their bodies came to the surface, and the water action took their soft tissues off. But in that part of the world where it's closer to the Arctic Circle, the water was cold, and they didn't come back. They just stayed down there, and they got buried. So we have two competing theories, the animal entrapment theory and the global flood theory. Let's see how they stack up against the facts. Oops. First fact, pits too small to trap large animals in general. Second fact, no hair, skin, internal organs, nor other soft tissues, even though tar is a preservative. We have water-saturated wood, lots of water bugs, but few common insects, predominance of predatory animals, no teeth marks on plant-eating animal bones, no weathering decay from the sun, most of the bones scattered and broken, no complete skeletons. So tar pit facts best explained by the global flood. I'd like to conclude my talk with talking about the most common animal, the saber-toothed cat. As you can see, it's second to the wolves. And it has a reputation of being the most fearsome, flesh-ripping, bone-crunching carnivores of the prehistoric world. Is that true? Okay, here's the saber-toothed cat's skull. And as you can see, it needs to open its mouth to its widest extent to get even a little bit of a bite. And those canines kind of get in the way of the bite. So in order to give it a really good bite, you have to move the jaw down about 90 degrees to even get that much of a bite. And this is very unnatural for animals like tigers and lions to have its mouth open that wide. So let's compare it to a Bengal tiger. The saber-toothed cat's canines are directed downward, whereas you see with the tiger, it's kind of forward. It's also the saber-toothed cat cannot direct its eyes to where it's going to take the tips of its canines, but the tiger can look directly and know where its teeth is going, so it can chase an animal very easily. The opening between upper and lower canines is smaller for the saber-toothed cat, whereas the opening for a tiger is much larger. So the tiger can get a really good bite versus the saber-toothed cat. So imagine the saber-toothed cat trying to chase an animal. Imagine the flat of my hand being the back of the animal. These canines are going to be in the way as it's trying to take down that animal with its teeth. So it's not going to be able to effectively take down an animal. Now, it's not the only saber-toothed cat. We also have a saber-toothed marsupial animal. So the sabers are very, very delicate things. They can break very easily. So in the case of this marsupial, God has given it these mandible flanges to protect the tips of its canines. So that gives you an idea that using these canines for aggressive meat-eating activity once those canines get broken, and they're useless. So there's what it looks like in life. There are at least 5 different animals in the fossil record with saber teeth, and God must have given them for some purpose that we don't understand today. Now, in the book of Genesis, it talks about how the lions would eat grass. All animals were eating grass and herbs. So I think that that was what happened before the flood, and after the flood, the environment changed so that meat eating became important for a good diet for some of these animals. So it's not just the carnivores that have the saber teeth. It's we also have a saber-toothed deer in the fossil record. Obviously, it's not a carnivore. And also, we have a living deer with saber teeth. It's Chinese water deer. They've observed it in nature. This deer will use its teeth to root plants or tear up plants or vines. It uses them for defense against its enemies, and it also uses them for display to attract females. So just because a saber-toothed cat had big canines doesn't mean it's a carnivore animal. So I see it as a plant-eating animal, suited to the plant-eating lifestyle. So in the early pre-flood world, oxygen and atmosphere pressure were higher. We know that because the air bubbles in amber or fossilized tree resin shows increased atmospheric pressure. Bubbles showed high levels of oxygen. So with high levels of oxygen and increased atmospheric pressure, you can get the large sizes of dinosaurs and elephants and so forth that we don't see today because we live in a world where the oxygen level is lower, so we can't absorb the oxygen as well as they could in the pre-flood world. Also, with the I believe there was a water canopy surrounding the earth, and so with the disappearance of the water canopy during the flood, cosmic radiation comes in, causing mutations, and going back to cats have lost the genetic code to absorb vitamin D and vitamin A. Would you give your cat a carrot? I don't know. Anybody have a cat that will eat a carrot? You have we have a cat. Our cat will eat a carrot, but most cats cannot live on a vegetarian diet or mainly vegetarian diet. They need their meat. Why? Because they lack something in their genetic code that we people and dogs and other animals have to be able to absorb their vitamin D or vitamin A from plants. So cats cannot get it from the sun like people and dogs. They cannot get it from plants. They must get it from meat sources. Also, they need lots of vitamin A. If they don't have vitamin A, it causes loss of hearing as well as skin, bones, and intestinal problems. They need to get that vitamin A from meat. So what about the saber-toothed cat? If the saber-toothed cat lived in the post-flood world, let's assume that it did go on the ark and it was let out, how would it survive? If it had damage to its genetic code so it can't eat plants anymore, then it has to go to a meat diet. But those canines, it would not be able to compete with cats like lions and tigers, which have better teeth for the meat-eating lifestyle. It cannot catch smaller prey with its long canines. Therefore, in the post-flood world, saber-toothed cats and the saber-toothed marsupials went extinct. So the saber-toothed cat is a reminder to me of how great our Lord is, how great thou art, as we sang on our song. And as we see in Psalm 104:24, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. So I'd like to think of the Brea Tar Pits as giving us a message for today, for people. The message is judgment of sin. These animals in the tar pits died because of man's sin. God saw the world and its wickedness, and he decided to destroy it with a flood. That's the judgment. But there was salvation through Noah's ark. The animals and people that went into the ark survived. And there's a message for us today that those of us who are not believers, who are not Christians, they will face judgment, eternity in hell. But people who are willing to go into the ark of Jesus Christ, they will have eternal life, they will be saved. And that's what I see in the Brea Tar Pits, that biblical message that God has for all mankind if they're willing to look at it. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Okay, I'm ready for questions.